The ideas and script for this video were developed and written by human beings. Technology was used to assist with the production.
Our video, titled Nigeria, You Don't Need Anyone's Permission to Develop Your Region, was well received. We welcome our viewers all over the world. In this video, titled Lessons for Nigeria from Shakespeare, Instruments of Darkness, Honest Trifles, Deepest Consequences, we draw on Banquo's warning in Macbeth to examine how political rhetoric may conceal deeper failures of leadership. William Shakespeare understood that deception does not always begin with an obvious lie. In Macbeth, Act 1, Scene 3, Banquo warns, "And oftentimes, to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles, to betrays in deepest consequence." From the outset, let us be unequivocal. Our argument should be used to judge political leaders by their records, authority, and measurable outcomes, and not declare that an individual should be dismissed merely because of ethnicity. Here are useful resources for our viewers. The learning objectives are on your screen. We interpret the education data and examine primary, junior secondary, and senior secondary completion rates by ethnicity of household head. We identify persistent educational disparities and compare the highest and lowest performing groups and understand the scale of the differences. We learn from Southern Nigeria's educational legacy. We evaluate leadership through measurable outcomes and assess political leaders by their stewardship, institutional achievements, and demonstrated commitment to the children within their communities. Today, we apply that lesson to political leadership in Nigeria. On your screen are three figures drawn from the 2023 Nigeria Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey conducted by the National Bureau of Statistics with UNICEF support. We need you to focus on the area in the red highlighted box pertaining to primary, junior secondary, and senior secondary completion rates according to the ethnicity of the household head. Let us begin with primary education. The three highest completion rates are Igbo-headed households at 97%, Ibibio-headed households at 96%, and Yoruba-headed households at 93%. Overall, the data demonstrate no meaningful statistical differences in completion rates between these groups. At the bottom are Hausa-headed households at 56%, Kanuri-headed households at 40%, and at the very bottom of the list are Fulani-headed households at 34% primary school completion rate, meaning that close to 2/3 of Fulani-headed households do not complete primary school, the very worst in the country. There are meaningful statistical differences between the Fulani and these other groups. Now consider junior secondary education. The three highest are Igbo at 92%, Yoruba at 88%, and Edo at 87%. Overall, the data demonstrate no meaningful statistical differences in completion rates between these groups. At the bottom are Hausa at 49%, Kanuri at 41%, and Fulani at 31%. Again, Fulani-headed households lag with now more than 2/3 of children not completing junior secondary school. Overall, the data demonstrate meaningful statistical differences in completion rates between these groups. Finally, consider senior secondary completion. The highest results are Igbo and Edo, both at 81%, followed by Yoruba at 77%. Overall, the data demonstrate no meaningful statistical differences in completion rates between these groups. At the bottom are Hausa at 36%, Kanuri at 32%, and Fulani at 19%. Overall, the data demonstrate meaningful statistical differences in completion rates between these groups. The Fulani-headed household and their leaders are well aware of the data from primary school to junior secondary school and senior secondary school. They have been privy to the declining rate of completion from 34% to 31% to an abysmal level of 19%. Their leaders seem to have done nothing about it. They appear to be only been interested in politics to the detriment of their children. Consider the incalculable harm that these leaders have caused these innocent, young, and bright children. Our words are not harsh enough. These are not differences of 1 or 2 percentage points. They are enormous disparities that persist from primary education through the end of secondary education. The question is not whether the children in the lowest performing communities possess ability. Of course they do. The question is, what have the political, traditional, religious, and institutional leaders who claim to represent these communities done with that ability? Where were they when children first failed to enter or complete primary school? Where were they when those children reached junior secondary age? Where were they when the losses became even greater at senior secondary level? Where were these so-called leaders when the late great Obafemi Awolowo invested heavily in free and compulsory education in Western Nigeria? Where were these so-called leaders when the late great Nnamdi Azikiwe expanded access to education across Eastern Nigeria? Where were these so-called leaders when the late great Michael Okpara invested heavily in education in Eastern Nigeria? Where were these so-called leaders when the late Professor Ambrose Ali pursued free education and expanded educational institutions across the then Bendel state? Where were these so-called leaders when Christian missionaries established primary, secondary, and tertiary institutions throughout southern Nigeria? It isn't that there have been no great leaders from northern Nigeria. The concern is that these great leaders are long gone. The great leaders that spoke up for these children and for the poor in their generation, such as the late great Malam Aminu Kano, a Fulani man, were ignored. Another Fulani, the late great Isa Wali, who spoke up forcefully for Western education to advance northern Nigeria, was ignored. The new crop of so-called northern leaders have a different agenda. Their priority is the acquisition and retention of political power, with the first task to oppress their own people and in particular northern children who have been neglected, disadvantaged, and denied the opportunities that education provides. Shame on them! A warning is also appropriate for the so-called leaders of southern Nigeria, particularly those in Yorubaland, who appear to have squandered many of the advantages created by their wise and forward-thinking predecessors. A senior secondary school completion rate of 77% is an abysmal failure. It is difficult to comprehend that almost 1/4 of children in Yoruba-headed households did not complete senior secondary school. What a disaster! What a shame! Like northern Nigeria, Yorubaland now appears to have produced a generation of uncaring leaders. We encourage the people to choose leaders who make education a genuine priority. Anything less risks leaving Yoruba children behind in an increasingly competitive world. We congratulate the Igbo people and encourage them not to rest on their laurels. Indomitable and ever resourceful, they continue to find ways to advance their great civilization. Igbo Kwenu. Therefore, where leaders had repeated warnings, real authority, and opportunities to intervene, continued neglect is not harmless. It damages childhood development, reduces future employment, weakens communities, and closes doors that may never reopen. That persistent pattern demands an answer from leaders who claim to speak for these communities. Before such a leader asks Nigerians for greater national authority, Nigerians are entitled to ask, what did you do for the children closest to your political base? No one must be permitted to destroy the lives of children. No belief system permits this kind of turning a blind eye and deaf ears to children. A leader may tell a small truth about one national problem, but Banquo's warning asks us to examine what that small truth is being used to conceal. A person who claims to care about every Nigerian child must demonstrate concern for the children already within that person's sphere of responsibility. Leadership begins with stewardship. National ambition must be preceded by local achievement. And where the record reveals prolonged failure, the public must not be distracted by honest trifles. Because, as Shakespeare warned, those trifles may eventually betray a nation in the deepest consequence. The learning objectives have been met. If you found this presentation informative and educational, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing and sharing with family members, friends, and colleagues. Your support helps us create more informative and educational content. Until next time, stay strong, stay hopeful. This has been a presentation of Opomulero Media, LLC.